The morning of my son David's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with October sunlight streaming through the windows of my modest apartment. I stood before my closet, fingers tracing the fabric of my best dress. A navy blue number I'd bought for his college graduation 3 years ago. It wasn't designer, but it was clean, pressed, and dignified. At 62, I'd learned that dignity was something you wore from the inside out. I'd raised David alone since his father walked out when he was 8. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. 23 years of double shifts at the diner, of choosing between groceries and new shoes, of celebrating every small victory and weathering every storm together. He was my pride, my joy, my greatest accomplishment. When he graduated law school and landed a position at a prestigious firm, I cried tears of pure happiness. All those sacrifices had been worth it. Then he met Isabella. Isabella Hartwell was everything I wasn't: polished, educated at private schools, connected to old money families that summered in the Hamptons. She was beautiful, I'll give her that, with her platinum blonde hair always styled to perfection, and designer clothes that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. But from our first meeting, I sensed something cold beneath that flawless exterior. "Mom, I want you to meet Isabella," David had said that day 6 months ago, his eyes bright with love and hope. Isabella had extended a manicured hand, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Mrs. Chen, so lovely to finally meet you. David has told me so much about you." The pause before "so much" spoke volumes. Over the following months, the slights were subtle but constant. She'd suggest restaurants she knew I couldn't afford, then act surprised when I declined. She'd make comments about David's humble beginnings, as if poverty were a character flaw. When they announced their engagement, she insisted on a wedding that cost more than most people's houses, paid for entirely by her father, of course. "We're having a small, intimate ceremony," she'd told me over lunch at yet another restaurant where the cheapest salad cost $30. "Just close family and important friends. You understand." I understood all right. I understood that in Isabella's world, I was neither close nor important. But David loved her, and I loved David. So I swallowed my hurt and bought my mother-of-the-groom dress with money I'd been saving for a new water heater. I practiced my smile in the mirror and prepared to play the role of the gracious, grateful, poor relation. The wedding venue was a sprawling estate in Connecticut, complete with manicured gardens, a private chapel, and enough marble to build a small cathedral. Luxury cars filled the circular drive: Mercedes, BMWs, a few Teslas. My 15-year-old Honda looked like a rust bucket among them. I clutched my small purse and walked toward the entrance, feeling every inch the outsider. The other guests swept past me in designer gowns and expensive suits, their conversations peppered with references to vacation homes and charity galas. I found my assigned seat, 3 rows back, near the wall, while Isabella's sorority sisters occupied the front row in a sea of pastel silk and inherited pearls. The ceremony was beautiful, I had to admit. Isabella looked like a princess in her custom gown, and David was handsome in his tailored tuxedo. As they exchanged vows, I wiped away tears of joy for my son, even as my heart ached at how small and insignificant I felt in this world of wealth and privilege. It was at the reception that everything fell apart. The ballroom was magnificent, draped in white silk and crystal, with centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I'd been seated at table 12, practically in another zip code from the head table where the happy couple held court. My table mates were pleasant enough, mostly distant relatives and family friends, but I felt like I was watching the celebration through glass. I was making my way back from the ladies' room, when I overheard Isabella talking to a group of her friends near the bar. They hadn't seen me approach, and their voices carried clearly over the gentle jazz music. Honestly, I don't know what David was thinking, Isabella was saying, gesturing with her champagne flute. Did you see what she wore? That dress looks like it came from a thrift store. And those shoes. She laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. I tried to hint that maybe she should skip the reception, but David got all sentimental about it. One of her friends, a reed-thin woman dripping in diamonds, leaned in conspiratorially. Well, darling, every family has their embarrassments. At least she's relegated to the back tables where she won't be in any of the important photos. Exactly, Isabella agreed. I mean, I understand David feels some obligation. She did raise him and all. But there's a difference between gratitude and subjecting your new family to that. She gestured vaguely in the direction of my abandoned table. Honestly, she's such a family embarrassment. I just pray she doesn't try to give some mortifying speech or anything. The other women tittered like a flock of well-dressed vultures, and I felt something die inside my chest. 23 years of loving David, of sacrificing everything for his future, reduced to a family embarrassment in an ill-fitting dress. I stood frozen behind a marble pillar, my cheeks burning with shame and fury. This was how she really saw me. Not as David's mother who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his SAT prep courses, not as the woman who'd held him while he cried over his first heartbreak, but as an inconvenient reminder of his humble origins. I was about to slink away when Isabella's voice dropped to a stage whisper. Thank God Daddy doesn't know about her background. He thinks David comes from good stock. If he knew his new son-in-law's mother was just a diner waitress who couldn't even afford a proper wedding gift. She shrugged eloquently. Well, let's just say Daddy values appearances above all else. That's when it clicked. Her father, Charles Hartwell. I knew that name. Not from society pages or business news, but from a much more personal connection. A memory surfaced, crystal clear despite the 30-year gap. A young man in an expensive suit, desperate and panicked, begging me not to call the police. I'd been 28 then, working the night shift at Murphy's Diner on Route 9. It was past midnight when he'd stumbled in, reeking of alcohol and fear, his BMW parked crooked in the lot outside. He'd hit someone, a pedestrian, and kept driving. But his conscience, or his terror, had gotten the better of him, and he'd driven around for hours before stopping at the first place he'd seen with lights on. I can't go to prison, he'd wept, his hands shaking as I poured him coffee. I'm getting married next month. I'm supposed to take over my father's company. Please, you have to help me. I should have called the police. I should have told him to turn himself in. Instead, I'd listened to his story. How he'd been at his bachelor party, how he'd had too much to drink, how it was dark and the person had come out of nowhere. He'd given me $5,000 in cash, more money than I'd ever seen at once, to forget I'd ever met him. This never happened, he'd said, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. You never saw me. I'd taken the money. God help me. I'd needed it so desperately. David was sick with pneumonia. I was behind on rent, and the hospital bills were mounting. I'd told myself the pedestrian was probably fine, that these things happened, that Charles Hartwell had learned his lesson. I'd been wrong. The next day's newspaper had confirmed my worst fears. A homeless veteran named Miguel Santos had been killed in a hit-and-run on Route 9. The police were looking for a dark sedan with front-end damage. Charles Hartwell had gotten his car fixed immediately and married his fiancée 2 weeks later. I'd carried that guilt for 30 years, even as I'd used his blood money to keep my son healthy and fed. I'd told myself I'd had no choice, but the truth was simpler and more damning. I'd chosen my son's welfare over justice for a stranger. Now, standing in his daughter's wedding reception, watching Isabella mock me while her father smiled benevolently from the head table, I felt the weight of 3 decades crash down on me. This was karma, perhaps, being humiliated by the family of the man whose crime I'd helped cover up. But as I watched Charles Hartwell raise his glass in a toast to his wonderful new son-in-law, I realized I had a choice to make. I could slink home with my tail between my legs, accept my role as the family embarrassment, and let Isabella's cruelty go unpunished. Or I could use the one card I'd never played. The decision crystallized like ice in my veins. I walked to the ladies' room, pulled out my phone, and did something I should have done 30 years ago. I Googled Miguel Santos hit and run, Route 9, 1993. The case was still open, still unsolved. There was even a tip line. But first, I had a speech to give. I returned to the ballroom and approached the bandleader during a break between songs. "Excuse me, I'm David's mother. Could I have the microphone for a moment? I'd like to say a few words." He handed it over without question. After all, who would deny the groom's mother her moment? The music stopped, and conversations gradually died as I walked to the center of the room. David looked surprised but pleased, giving me an encouraging smile from the head table. Isabella looked less thrilled, her perfect composure slipping for just a moment. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "For those who don't know me, I'm Margaret Chen, David's mother." Polite applause rippled through the room. I caught Isabella whispering urgently to her father, probably warning him about the family embarrassment who was about to mortify them all. "I want to thank the Hartwell family for hosting this beautiful celebration," I continued. "Charles, your daughter looks absolutely radiant tonight." Charles Hartwell beamed and raised his glass to me. He was older now, his hair silver instead of brown, his face lined with age and prosperity, but I recognized him clearly. He had no idea who I was. Why would he? I'd been just another anonymous waitress in a cheap uniform. "I've been thinking a lot about family tonight," I went on, my eyes finding Isabella's increasingly pale face. "About the bonds that connect us, the secrets we keep, and the truths we sometimes have to face." David was starting to look concerned now. He knew his mother well enough to recognize that tone. "You see, 30 years ago, I was a single mother working nights at Murphy's Diner to support my son. It was hard work, honest work, but it didn't pay much. Sometimes you had to make difficult choices to survive." The room was completely silent now, all attention focused on me. Isabella's knuckles were white around her champagne flute. One night, October 15th, 1993, to be exact, a man came into the diner. He was young, wealthy, terrified. He'd just killed someone in a hit-and-run accident and needed help covering it up. A gasp went up from several tables. Charles Hartwell had gone completely still, his face draining of color. The victim was Miguel Santos, a homeless veteran. The driver was drunk, returning from his bachelor party. He gave me $5,000 to forget I'd ever seen him. I paused, letting the words sink in. I took the money. I was desperate, and I chose my son's welfare over justice. It was the worst decision of my life, and I've regretted it every day since. The silence in the room was deafening. Isabella looked like she was going to be sick. David's face was a mask of confusion and growing horror. But standing here tonight, listening to how I'm just a family embarrassment, how my background is something to be ashamed of, I realized something. I turned my gaze directly to Charles Hartwell, whose face had gone ashen. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. Charles Hartwell stood slowly, his legs visibly shaking. Recognition dawned in his eyes, not of my face, but of the story, of the night that had haunted him for 30 years. "You," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Me," I confirmed. "The diner waitress who helped you cover up Miguel Santos's murder." The room erupted. Guests began talking at once, voices rising in shock and disbelief. Isabella let out a strangled sob and buried her face in her hands. David stared at me like he'd never seen me before. "I've already called the police tip line," I said into the microphone, my voice cutting through the chaos. "They'll be very interested to hear about the BMW with front-end damage that Charles Hartwell had repaired the day after Miguel Santos died." Charles Hartwell collapsed back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Two of his business associates were already edging toward the exits, no doubt calculating the damage this revelation would do to their own reputations. "Mom." David's voice was strangled. He'd made his way through the crowd and was standing before me, his face pale with shock. "Is this true?" I looked at my son, my beautiful, successful, heartbroken son, and felt my resolve waver. But then I remembered Isabella's cruel laughter, her casual dismissal of my worth, her certainty that I was too ashamed of my background to ever fight back. "Yes," I said quietly, handing the microphone to a stunned waiter. "It's true. All of it." "You took money to cover up a murder?" David's voice cracked on the last word. "I took money to feed you when you had pneumonia and I was 3 months behind on rent," I replied. "It was wrong, but I did it for you. Everything I've ever done has been for you." David stepped back as if I'd slapped him. "You destroyed evidence. You helped a killer escape justice. For money." The judgment in his voice was like a knife to my heart, but I'd known this moment would come eventually. The truth always has a price. "And now you've destroyed my marriage," he continued, gesturing toward Isabella, who was sobbing into her maid of honor's shoulder. "No," I said firmly. "I've told the truth. What happens next is up to all of you." The police arrived 20 minutes later. I'd given them the address when I'd called the tip line. Charles Hartwell didn't resist when they led him away in handcuffs, though he did turn back once to look at me with something that might have been gratitude. Isabella was hysterical, alternating between blaming me for ruining her wedding and begging David not to leave her. The guests fled like roaches when the lights come on, many of them already on their phones, no doubt alerting their lawyers and publicists. David stood in the middle of the chaos, still in his tuxedo, looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed, which I suppose it had. "I need time to process this," he said when I approached him. His voice was hollow, distant. "I need to understand what you've done. What we're all going to have to live with now." "David, No." He held up a hand. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time." He walked away from me then, leaving me alone in the ruins of his wedding reception. The next few weeks were a blur of media attention, legal proceedings, and family devastation. Charles Hartwell was charged with vehicular homicide and leaving the scene of an accident. I was granted immunity in exchange for my testimony, but the court of public opinion was less forgiving. The story made national news. Diner waitress's 30-year secret destroys wedding. I was painted alternately as a hero whistleblower and a money-grubbing accomplice. Neither characterization felt particularly accurate. Isabella filed for annulment, claiming fraud, that David had misrepresented his family background. The legal battle was vicious and public, with my past mistakes splashed across tabloid headlines. David's law firm quietly suggested he take a leave of absence until the scandal died down. I lost my job at the insurance office where I'd worked for the past decade. Apparently, harboring knowledge of a 30-year-old crime made me a liability. My neighbors alternated between treating me like a pariah and a celebrity. I preferred the pariah treatment. David didn't speak to me for 3 months. When he finally called, it was late on a Thursday evening in February. I was in my apartment, eating a microwave dinner and watching a rerun of an old sitcom, when my phone rang. "Mom?" Just that one word, but I could hear 30 years of confusion, hurt, and love tangled up in it. "Hi, sweetheart." I need to see you. Can I come over? Of course. He arrived an hour later, looking tired and older than his 27 years. We sat at my small kitchen table, drinking instant coffee and avoiding each other's eyes. The annulment went through, he said eventually. I'm sorry. Are you? His voice was sharp. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you got exactly what you wanted. Isabella's gone, her father's in prison, and I'm alone. I never wanted you to be alone, I said quietly. I just couldn't stand by and let her treat me like garbage while her father walked free. So you destroyed my life to save your pride? I destroyed my own life to find my conscience, I corrected. Your life isn't destroyed, David. It's just different now. He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. Miguel Santos had a daughter, he said eventually. She's reached out to thank me for what you did. Apparently, she's been fighting for 30 years to get his case reopened. I felt something ease in my chest. I'm glad. She wants to meet you. I'd like that. Another long silence. Then, I keep thinking about what you said at the wedding. About everything you did being for me. Did you really think I'd want a life built on covering up someone's death? I thought I was protecting you, I said. I was 28 and desperate and making the best decision I could with the information I had. And now? Now I know that some prices are too high to pay, no matter what you're protecting. David looked up at me then, really looked at me, for the first time since the wedding. Isabella was right about one thing, he said softly. You are embarrassing. My heart clenched, but before I could respond, he continued. You're embarrassing because you're braver than anyone in that ballroom. Because you chose truth over comfort, justice over silence. Because you were willing to sacrifice our relationship to do what was right, even 30 years too late. Tears sprang to my eyes. David, I don't know if I can forgive you yet for keeping this secret, he said. But I'm proud of you for finally telling it. We talked until dawn, working through 3 decades of secrets and lies, examining the choices we'd made and the prices we'd paid. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. 6 months later, I stood in a courtroom watching Charles Hartwell receive his sentence. 5 years in prison and $1 million settlement to Miguel Santos's family. The judge called it a delayed but necessary reckoning. David was there with me, and afterward, we met Sofia Santos, Miguel's daughter, for coffee. She was a teacher, a mother of 3, and she had her father's gentle eyes. She thanked me for coming forward, even 30 years late. He was a good man, she told me. He struggled with demons after the war, but he was trying to get clean. He was walking to his AA meeting the night he was killed. I cried then, for Miguel Santos and for the 30 years his family had waited for answers, and for the young woman who'd taken blood money and convinced herself it was justified. Isabella moved to California and married a tech executive within a year. I heard she tells people she's a widow rather than admit her first marriage was annulled due to scandal. Some people never learn. David and I are still rebuilding our relationship, taking it one honest conversation at a time. He's started dating again, a public defender named Sarah who grew up in foster care and understands that families come in all shapes and sizes, with all kinds of complicated histories. I'm working part-time at a nonprofit that helps homeless veterans, my small attempt at paying a debt I can never fully repay. It doesn't erase what I did, but it helps me sleep at night. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept my mouth shut at the wedding, if I'd just accepted my role as the family embarrassment and faded quietly into the background. Isabella would still be married to my son, Charles Hartwell would still be walking free, and Miguel Santos's family would still be waiting for answers. But I've learned that some embarrassments are worth embracing, being embarrassing to people who value appearance over substance, wealth over character, silence over truth. That's not a failure. That's a badge of honor. The last time I saw Isabella, she was getting into a Tesla in the parking lot of an upscale grocery store. She pretended not to see me, but her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys. Some prices, I've learned, never stop being paid. As for me, I'm 63 now, living in a smaller apartment, working for a fraction of my old salary, and largely estranged from the social circle I'd briefly inhabited as David's mother. But I sleep well at night, and I can meet my own eyes in the mirror each morning. Sometimes the truth costs everything, but silence costs more. Every family has its embarrassments. I've decided I'd rather be the embarrassment who tells the truth than the respectable one who lives a lie. It's taken me 30 years and one disastrous wedding speech to learn that lesson, but some education is worth the price. Miguel Santos deserved justice. His family deserved answers. And David, my beautiful, complicated son, deserved to know who his mother really was, not the sanitized version I'd presented for so many years. In the end, Isabella was right about one thing. I was a family embarrassment. I just wasn't embarrassed about it anymore.